Melissa Norris here. You're listening to the Dragging Alaska podcast, where David Bays and I sit down with candidates running for governor, Senate, and House to talk about one issue: trawl fishing in Alaska. It's one of the most talked about topics in this year's elections, and our goal is simple: help Alaskans understand where each candidate stands and what they plan to do about it. We are honored to be joined today by Senator Shelley Hughes, who is one of our 2026 gubernatorial candidates for the race of Alaska governor. So welcome, Shelley.
Yeah, well, thank you, Melissa, for having me. This topic is a hot one right now. Wouldn't you agree?
I would agree. It's actually really, I think David and I are most excited about the fact that so many of you are taking it seriously and talking about it and engaging with folks like us, because without this discussion today and others like it, I mean, we're just dead in the water, so to speak. Yeah, thanks, Shelley, for taking it on. I think you were one of the first people to really come out and be like, no, this is not okay.
You know, I'm a very honest and forthright person, and I will say prior to May of 2025, I had some vague something about bycatch, but it didn't really hit me in the face until I was sitting in a Senate Resources meeting in Juneau as a member of that committee and hearing the first presentation on Senate Bill 161. I'm trying to remember the title of the bill. Prohibit
the word
trawl
bottom is in there.
bottom trawl, I think it was, or bottom trawling, and it
Yeah.
pertained, of course, to the jurisdiction the state has, which is in state waters. And I sat there and listened, and I thought, first of all, Senator Cronk is brave taking this on, because I knew the industry wouldn't be happy. But it was really clear to me that this was an issue we couldn't be ignored. And then shortly thereafter, the documentary came out, which actually informed me of the greater problem of actually threatening our fisheries long term. In other words, destroying the habitat to the point that who knows if our fish would ever come back. We were already experiencing problems in the state upriver, but the fact that we could just basically decimate the fisheries altogether, it was like, whoa. And that's when, started looking at over the summer and fall, connected with David, and really began to drill down, because the whole point is to try to solve the problem, not talk about it, right? So what would be feasible? What would you actually have to do to address it? And came up with a pretty comprehensive action plan that I put out. I think it was an 11 or 12-minute video, 3-pronged approach, hit it at the NPFMC, the North Pacific Fishery Management Council level, as governor, and the authority that a governor would have there, with very specific proposals, and make sure that the appointees actually would stick together with the commissioner, and of course make sure the commissioner that I would choose would be 100% on board to address this. And then looking at it at the state level, any state laws that we could change, and then really pushing at the federal level as well. So it really got me thinking that this is a challenge that cannot be delayed. And so the fact that you all are emphasizing this and educating Alaskans and making all the candidates realize that it's time to address this, I have to laugh. And I've had, I don't know how many people make a comment to the impact. I don't know what the saying is, something like, what is it? Imitation is the best form of flattery, or something like that.
Yeah.
Because as soon as I came out with the video, the other candidates started stepping up and making statements. And I've done that in other areas besides. The most recent, I'm hearing, I've been the only candidate, and for a couple of years actually, and actually for my entire legislative history, very supportive of the agricultural industry and how that's a sector of our private economy that has the potential to expand. And now I hear other candidates are jumping on that wagon too, but that's fine. We can set the standard, we can plant the flag, and if the other candidates are talking about it, that's a good thing, because it will not be forgotten and something will come of it.
Yeah, I would agree that if that's your only role in all of it, you've done everyone a wonderful service.
Of course, I hope my role is a little bit more. I'd actually like to be the one, because that's another thing. And I know we're here to talk about fish. We're not here to talk about my candidacy. But I will say, ask my husband, ask people that worked in me. I am incredibly, incredibly persistent, and I don't let go. And once I've got a solution in mind, I am going to try to navigate it and get it through. If I hit obstacles, I immediately start thinking, how can we get around this obstacle? How can we strategize to get this through? That's been my history. That's why I have been able to successfully get major accomplishments across the finish line in an incredibly tricky legislature. Being able to work across the entire political spectrum and have good relationships with all those people, I think is a real asset going into even taking care of something like this. And now with the work that David and others have accomplished, the support for fixing this to finding a remedy is huge. You can't walk away from it. It reminds me of when, I don't know if you remember here in Alaska, the disastrous soft on crime bill, SB 91, backfired and shoplifting increased, home thefts, car thefts. And, I was the first one that came out and said, this is a mistake. We have to repeal it. And the good Lord allowed me to be the Senate Judiciary Chair, and I led that repeal. That was a case where the public was so fully behind repealing that even the legislators that were trying to cling to what was in the bill and keep it in there, which we ended up stripping everything out. But when they were initially trying to keep it in, we thought, well, they're not going to support voting for the repeal. Even they voted for the repeal in the end because there was such full public support. And I think the bycatch issue is similar. Alaskans are recognizing this is an issue that cannot be ignored, and we have to take it by the bull by the horns at this point.
Food security had been a big pet project, I guess we'll say, of yours for a long time, hadn't it? I think you represented Palmer, so you were off the coast, but I mean, food security in Alaska is food security.
Yeah, and fish, as a natural protein and an important and healthy one was always part of that conversation. And yeah, I've been on that path and the champion in the legislature for that. I'm excited. There's some legislators who are going to be stepping up to take that role, but as governor, that is going to be really important. And this is kind of going into another area, but it's related to bycatch. It's related to the importance of the fisheries. The state is struggling fiscally. And so we've seen our PFD go down, down, down. And there's talk that we may not have a PFD in a couple of years. And I think of what are the other dividends do we benefit from in this state? We live in a beautiful state. One of the benefits has been to fill our freezer with fish, have delicious smoked salmon. I mean, that's a dividend. And even that right now is threatened. So I think it's an issue we have to address as soon as possible.
There's also been that conversation, I guess, Shelley, about the impact of low fish returns to the Yukon River and how that gets into mammals like moose and caribou. I think you mentioned that in one of your videos.
Yeah, that is true. And everything's connected, right? All these systems are connected. And when Governor Dunleavy is extending the moose season up the Yukon to ensure people have protein because they were not able to get the fish they normally would have gotten. And now the fish also are not available to the bears, and the bears are killing the moose. I mean, so it's all connected, and all these things have to be addressed at the root level, and the root level for at least the human cause is the trawling industry.
So part of your solution, the plan that I was reading about on your website, let's start from the very beginning, if you don't mind going into some of the detail on that with us. So you said it starts with the NPFMC, 6 appointed seats by Alaska, and the governor has the power for that. Well, we have the power to put the seats up there and then hopefully get them approved.
The Secretary of Commerce puts the final stamp on them. Just so people know, as governor, my vetting process would have this be a top priority, ensure anyone that I would appoint would agree with the various proposals to prohibit the mid trawling, down on the floor, to a real chum limit, not one that's fluff and there's no real consequences, and it's just kind of out there trying to make you look like you're doing something. These kind of things, and paired with that, you've got to make sure your commissioner is on board and has a kind of leadership that can keep those NPFMC members together and informed. So that would be any names that would go before, well, actually with those, they don't go before the legislature. I forget, a lot of those things are confirmed by the legislature. In this case, they're not. So just make sure everybody's on the same page and it goes to the Secretary of Commerce. Now, I want to say, because of my proven track record and experience, I have worked with DC a lot because so much is impacted here in our state by things that the federal government has done. So that is, whether it was getting the presidential permit for the Alaska to Alberta rail crossing, it's called A2A, just pushing for that. Last year was able to get specific legislation, and this is related to food security. And actually, actually with fish too. We have a problem with our weather observation stations equipment at rural airports not being functional. And because of that, it was causing food spoilage because of, the pilot is not going to fly somewhere unless he knows he can safely land. And so there had been very vague language in the FFA Act. And so it was up for reauthorization last year. And we got really specific language as far as those repairs needing to happen in a very timely fashion, even having spare parts available in state so they could be quickly repaired and back up and running. So I have worked a lot at the federal level on things. So I think working with the Secretary of Commerce to make sure the Secretary understands this importance to Alaska. And, I was thinking, I know it's called the North Pacific Fishery Management Council. And, this may seem like, well, it's not that material, but the fact that it's called that, I would rather it be called the Alaska Fisheries Management Council, because those are the waters that are impacted. When you think of North Pacific, you kind of think of Oregon and Washington too, and that's not really the case. They have their own FMC. So a name change to that would be something. I don't know if that would require an act of Congress, if that requires federal law change, but to me, it would make sense because, and that's what I would point out to the Secretary. This is an Alaskan issue.
I guess I didn't realize they had their own FMCs.
Yeah.
They do, don't they, David?
So that's where it gets complex. So the North Pacific Fisheries Management Council only deals with fisheries offshore of Alaska, even though it has reps from Oregon and Washington. But Oregon and Washington have their own council. It's the Pacific Fisheries Management Council, which just deals with like Oregon, Washington, California. So it's ironically close to made up of theirs, because really the only way they can profit from having a say in these Alaskan fisheries is to send big boats up here. And a lot of times that's a factory model, and the factory model is typically trawls. Even if we see like a commissioner of Fish and Game for Oregon or a commissioner of Fish and Game for Washington State, they'll make a claim that they're really into the biology and the statistics, but the reality is that the best way for their state to profit from these Alaska fisheries is essentially less regulation.
Yeah, and while we're talking about the federal aspect, I think there's been a lot of frustration and confusion as far as what our federal delegation can and should do. My sense is they would help, but they can't get it through the Senate because the Washington senators and probably Oregon would hop in there too. They would prevent the vote from going through. So you might, in the particular makeup we have right now, we could probably get something through on the House side, but I don't think it's reasonable to ever think you could get it through the Senate at the federal level, even if the makeup changed a bit. You're just not with Washington and Oregon people on the council and tied to the industry. It's just not going to happen. So I think the governor addressing it is your best bet. It doesn't mean we shouldn't try to make changes at the federal level and make sure the Secretary of Commerce understands how important this issue is to Alaska's economy. But I just don't think you're going to get a law change to take care of it. I don't know, David, you might disagree with me, but that's my analysis is you can't get something through the Senate.
Yeah, I don't think as far as speed or efficiency, I 100% think the Alaska governor is the route to take. I mean, if they started to reopen Magnuson-Stevens Act, that would have to go through Congress, both levels, and I think 10 years would be pretty quick there. I'm not saying we shouldn't start that 10-year process now or should have started 10 years ago, but the Alaska governor has the power to switch out all the NPFMC members in a 4-year term, and that's just the quickest and most efficient. And it's essentially a surefire way when you choose who you vote for Alaska governor. If they say they're going to do this, they don't have to deal with 500 members of Congress in D.C. It's them, essentially.
Right. Yeah. And I think, and Melissa, you can steer the conversation a different way because I know this is people interested in the fisheries. But because the governor is so pivotal, one of the things Alaskans need to consider is, now that all the candidates are talking, well, virtually all of them, I think, are talking about it, then we have to step back and say, who would be the most effective to get this fixed, and who can we trust to get this fixed?
Mhm.
Because there is a history, not just in Alaska, but across the state, that politicians say things when they campaign and then they change when they get elected. And so you have a lot of people who have never served in elected office, and that can seem like, oh, that's a fresh perspective, bring someone in new kind of thing. But there is a bit of a risk there because you don't know what they're going to do once they're elected. So that's something that Alaskans should consider as far as addressing this. If I weren't running for governor, I would be looking at someone who I know that they've always stuck to their word, and what they've campaigned on, that's what they stuck to while they served. And so I fit that definition, and really am the only one of all the candidates that has the kind of track record that can deal with the legislature. There's one other probably has been pretty successful navigating the legislature as well. But I think that's really, really important to have someone who's stuck with their word. And there's so many other things at stake. This is a huge issue and has, I don't know, probably 90-10 approval or something like that. And so I think it's something we can address. But some of the other issues that are going to impact the economy, which fisheries is part of our economy too, I think it's going to be important to have someone that can address all those aspects of our economy. And so I wouldn't be running if I didn't think I'd be effective in that way. And like I said, I'm super persistent. And so once I start on something, if I get blocked, I will figure out how to get around it, re-strategize as necessary, and make headway.
So if I read your plan correctly, your ideas during your 4 years, you would be able to replace all trawl vested seats on the NPFMC board, and you'd have a commissioner that followed suit with the state's wishes. Have you put any thought into some of those particular people yet, or is that putting the cart before the horse?
I have asked for that input. I believe I asked David, and I have yet to build a list, but I am committed to make sure they're properly vetted and dedicated to addressing this issue. So I can tell Alaskans that, but I've yet to really gather names. I was in Cordova talking to fishermen there. Southeast is interesting. Cordova is not really Southeast, but down in Southeast, Ketchikan, Juneau, they banned trawling. I'm not sure how many years ago. So they're not impacted. And that's a lot of the fishing community I've spoken with, but they also understand that a lot of those people, my nephew is an example. So he commercial fishes in Southeast, but he also goes out to Bristol Bay. And he was the first one who actually kind of started talking about the problem of bycatch to me. And that was this spring before I was in that hearing. And so that definitely the fishing industry in Southeast Alaska understands that trawling is really, really bad news. So, I think that, like I said, there's widespread public support. I will say I was at a meeting a couple of weeks ago. It was a resource development meeting. Afterwards, I was chatting with people, and the room had pretty much cleared out. And there were 3 people remaining in the room, and I didn't know who they were from Adam, but they were all connected to the trawling industry. And they came up and said they wanted to meet with me. And of course, I'm happy to meet with anyone. They did. I will say this. They did thank me that I was not pushing a full on out ban, which, I was talking about doing that, and I'd be open to doing that. But as David has indicated, that's not a very realistic approach. Better to put really tight restrictions, which will probably just make the trawlers say, it's not worth it doing here, and they'll pick up and leave. So it effectively would result in the same as a ban, but it's not outright banning, because I tell you, I think it'd be very, very difficult for a U.S. Secretary of Commerce to support a full-on ban, because that Commerce Secretary is tasked to be supportive of all the parts and pieces of an economy, all the different industries. So I just don't think that's a realistic approach, but I believe that it could be the final result, unless they come up with super affordable technology that can really eliminate bycatch and eliminate harming the ocean floor.
Yeah, and I should step in and support that. I think that people really want to ban, and obviously that's understandable. And I'm not opposed to the idea of it, but I'm also a fisherman, so I hate to see people banning any type of fishery tomorrow. But I think, as you've just said, the common sense prevails when we get non-trawlers on the NPFMC, and then they start to essentially just enforce the existing regulations. So that example of no midwater nets on bottom, or no trawling in halibut nurseries, or bycatch limits that float up and down with abundance to actually be restrictive. Trawl has already told us that they can't exist under any of those regulations, and that's why we see these multi-million-dollar responses to any time a what seems like a common sense regulation comes up. Yeah, I think you're on the right track, and I think that's the realistic track, is that people are going to have to put different people on NPFMC, enforce the existing regulations, and then if industry can adapt, it will be a new conversation, but they're already claiming they can. But they have to play under the same legal rules as everyone else, or they should, so that's just, I don't know, their day will come, I guess, of making that decision.
The one aspect of the action plan that I put forward was what we could do in state waters. And I know that's a tiny, tiny part of the overall bycatch problem. But I think if we made a statement as a state and really put our foot down on in-state waters, that would speak highly to the U.S. Secretary, which I think is important. It would also cause those that are trawlers to make any kind of adjustments if they want to keep harvesting in state waters. And I think the idea of having, for instance, one of my proposals was to allow troopers to, I can't remember what I called it, but where you wouldn't know they were a trooper, right? They'd come in and be one of the observers. And, that's something unique, and it wouldn't be that hard to do. I think also training all your observers really to know what would be happening, to know that when they go to their, leave the scene and where all the action is and are going off into their quarters or the restroom or whatever, to know that that's when things could be happening. So they're very aware of that and maybe unexpectedly could show back up. Things like that. I think they just need to be trained in a way before they go out there. Those are things you could do in state waters that we have jurisdiction to do. Of course, you could ban the mid-water trawlers from bottom trawling. There are a number of other things we could do in state waters to really set the precedent and to communicate that this is a huge issue for Alaska, and we're done with tolerating what's been going on for too many years.
Yeah, I think that trooper undercover idea could really be good. So I do charters out of Homer, and they occasionally, trooper or NOAA officer will pay to come along as an undercover customer, essentially, and they're looking at who sets the hook, or how long the fish is, or what the limit is. Anyways, which are all essentially, I won't say meaningless, but it seems like small fish compared to 16,000 pounds of waste per hour. But it does help with rule following, essentially. There's always that threat, the unknown. I just don't think trawlers had to deal with that. But we do see lots of reports of sexual harassment and physical assault. There's actually the NOAA Observer Manual, essentially. It's like 300 pages, but it tells the observers ways that they're often scammed, essentially. The trawlers might try and hide fish or bycatch from you. So there's this acknowledgement within NOAA fisheries that this is happening, but then when they start doing the scientific report and building their data off it, they just take the observer data as this golden standard, which is unflawed. That leads to assumptions that don't save fish.
Yeah, and I think in state waters, we also could set a precedent as far as monitoring, measuring, reporting, and making sure those systems are accurate, because I think there is some question now in federal waters as far as monitoring, measuring, and reporting. So I think you've got to get your baseline, and you have to make sure, there aren't cracks in that and things slipping through unnoticed. I think that will be very, very important going forward. And I think, like I said, if we were to adopt something in state waters, we could kind of develop what works and then encourage that the federal government would do the same. I also say, I don't know if this would take an act of Congress, but the fact that the NPFMC appoints its advisory panel, that is bizarre. That is really bizarre. Typically, boards that review things are independent and not tied. So when you have, I think it's almost half of the folks on the advisory panel not being Alaskans, most of the panel being somehow tied back to the trawling industry and being appointed by the council, it doesn't make sense. So I don't know if that's in law or if that's a regulation, something the secretary would have the ability to adjust. But I think that's a fundamental issue too. Of course, an advisory panel is just an advisory panel. So you still have to put the blame at the feet of the council because they could vote differently. And we saw, recently on the kind of fluffy chum proposal that they adopted, that they did take the advice of the panel, and that's unfortunate. They would not have had to, but I think, they're all on the same page on this, at least enough votes are. And so I think that's problematic. Advisory panels ought to be independent.
David, do you want to just take a moment to summarize what just happened with the NPFMC board meeting here in the Chum Bycatch a couple weeks ago?
Yeah, for sure. Shelley, you're 99% correct on what they adopted from the advisory panel. So I think the advisory panel had recommended that they do no bycatch limit at all, so no number associated with it. But the actual NPFMC voted to do 45,000 Western Alaska chum per year limit, which sounds pretty good, except that they kind of cherry pick these Western Alaska chum out of the grand total. Now, the Gulf of Alaska doesn't have any cap. There's no cap on chum of other genetic origin. And they also have this 45,000 fish limit for Western Alaska chum, but that's essentially been their 10-year average. I think their 10-year average from maybe 2013 to 2023 was 46,500 chum per year. And now the runs have crashed. So the odds of them ever hitting that historic average are essentially down the drain. So we refer to it as a non-restraining cap, essentially. And then the cap doesn't trigger total fishery closure like we would think of for other fisheries. So I think the wording on there is that if they hit this 45,000 chum limit, then they have a partial closure of some fishing areas, something to that effect. The program which runs it is essentially created by industry. It gets checked off on by the feds. After that, the feds, federal law enforcement, doesn't really have legal enforcement teeth to it. They essentially are reviewing the plan, which is run by industry. So there again, it's just this odd caveat, kind of particular to trawl, that we just don't see in other fisheries, and it feels like favoritism, essentially. So sorry, that's a long-winded recap.
Well, and then back to, if you're not monitoring, measuring, and reporting accurately, I mean, they could exceed that,
for sure,
by double. If you don't know it, you don't know it. So that's where I think you have to go back to fundamentals. I also want to mention, and I get it. I'm being accused, oh, you're just on this issue because, you're running. Well, I would say back in May, I didn't think I was going to run, and I was on this issue. So I'll say that. But also, I walk the walk. I don't just talk the talk. So I have submitted comments to NOAA back whenever that was. I submitted comments to the International Pacific Halibut Commission. I submitted comments to the Norris Pacific Fisheries Management Council. I showed up in person and listened to testimony to the advisory council. And I have also written the legislatures to hear the Senate Bill 161, House Bill 203. So I don't just talk about this to get elected. I am walking it to try to make change. Whether or not I become the governor, this is an issue that needs to be addressed, so other people can make little sound bites, and that's fine. They're free to do that. But to me, we need a comprehensive plan that is feasible and that, the next governor is committed to do. And by golly, if I'm not the next governor and they want to take my 11-minute, 3-pronged comprehensive action plan and move on it, I will say hallelujah, because that's the kind of effort it's going to take. You have to approach it from all sides. I think it's going to be hard to get Senator Cronk's bill moving. It's unfortunate, but people get super.
Why?
I would say because there's unfortunately sometimes too much partisanship in Juneau. And I will say, on the one hand, the media overemphasizes that because many things, it is bipartisan. We just move through and there's no big news story about it. On this issue, though, because it's a hot item and a minority member is bringing it forward, Senator Cronk. I think the majority is going to resist letting his bill go through. Now, maybe they could be convinced to make it a committee bill and move it through. I don't know. But unfortunately, on big issues, it can get a bit partisan rather than bipartisan. So I also, in the House, the bill is in the Fisheries Committee, and Representative Louise Stutes chairs that from Kodiak. I'm not sure. I know there is some trawl industry in Kodiak, so I'm not sure she wants to take that on. So you can't get a bill through just one half and have a change. It's got to go through both bodies. So I think it's a big lift, but, and I've been actually a little bit frustrated, and I will confess to you, David, because on the big public support page that you have, I've made a couple posts, put your money behind your mouth. Are you just going to come on here and whine about the problem? Because there are specific things. I wonder how many people have actually put pressure on the legislature to hear those bills. If 1/5 of the people on that page were to press the legislature to hear SB 161, I think it would start moving. I think they'd have a hearing. But when it's just me and a couple of other people, it doesn't happen. And I tell you, I know someone commented, it's too hard. You have to pull all those emails. Could there just be a website where you click and put in your email and it sends something automatically? Yeah, you could do that. And, maybe the Stop Trawl Bycatch page, maybe you all would want to do that, and it might be a little bit effective. But I can tell you from being on the other side of this as a former legislator, former senator, when I would get 200 emails that are form emails, they didn't mean near as much as 5 personally written emails. So it is actually better to do personally written emails. And if you did set up some kind of form where you sent people could do it easily, I would certainly make it set up so the person could compose their own line or two about the bill, because something that comes through, thousands of emails that are identical, they're just going to be, staff will just move them aside into a folder or move them inside into the trash bin. So I think if we use the voices that we had, we could make some tracks on SB 161. But unless there's huge public activism, I don't think you will. Activism is not whining on a Facebook page. It's actually picking up the phone, writing an email.
Yeah, is there a deadline or a timeline where we can get that moving?
Yeah, the bill dies at the end of this session, which will probably be in May. In order to get it through both bodies, I would say the pressure would need to be on. This is already past the midpoint of February. I would say in the next two weeks, you'd have to have a lot of pressure on the Senate Resources Committee.
So I think,
because,
sorry, Melissa, I think, so Shelley, I'd seen you'd done a post on this a while ago, the letter which you had sent encouraging them to take it on. It didn't really get much response on the page, but I think we could dig that up, Melissa, and we could add that link in Shelley's letter that she wrote to this podcast so that anybody watching this can find it at the end or down in the comments. And yeah, like you're saying, we've run into this issue with the NPFMC. If there's a form letter and they get it 2,000 times, they essentially take all 2,000, smash them into one, and count it as a single comment. So I definitely encourage people not to cut and paste, even if you just change it a little bit. And and there's no perfect comment. This is how it affects me, this is where I'm from, and this is what I think you should do. So absolutely. And I think, is it Kathy Giesel that it's chairing the Natural Resources?
Yeah.
So
she is chairing the Senate Resources Committee. So you would send it to her and all the members on the committee. And actually, for something like this, sending it to all 60 legislators, you could address it to Senator Giesel and the members of the Senate Resources Committee, but blasting it out to all 60 so everybody knows this is a big deal and they see things coming in from around the state in addition to their own district. I think it would have impact, but I would say those letters, if they don't start flooding inboxes before the end of a couple of weeks, I don't know that you can get it through the process.
Okay.
Yeah,
thank you for that.
Yeah.
And we invited Mike on to join us, and he's checking his schedule so we could get him to explain that bill a little more detailed for us too.
Yeah.
And that'll help.
Yeah, and he's open to some adjustments. I went back and listened to the hearing a couple months ago, and there could be some adjustments and improvements. But the point is to take a stand in state waters would set a precedent communicate to the U.S. Secretary that we mean business, and give the trawl industry also, basically, if they want to fish in state waters, they'd have to figure out how to make the adjustments to meet the restrictions. And what we might see is they might say, okay, we're not going to do it in state waters, which tells us too that if you impose strict restrictions, they're just going to move away.
I think so. The campaign finance reports came out yesterday or the day before. I think Kathy Giesel was one of the ones listed with money coming in from Trident Seafoods. So yeah, it'd be good for people to get on there. And Louise Stutz as well are 2 out of the 4 listed. So yeah, those are the 2 people that kind of manage the gates on both stages.
Here's another trick. Because before I served, I used to do policy advocacy in the healthcare world, as a private citizen. And so I've learned a lot of things with what you can do. So if you can't get a bill through, and we did this, I worked with Democrat Garen Tarr, who from Anchorage at the time. So for a couple years, we were trying to tighten up some sexual assault laws to help get perpetrators off the streets. And Senator Matt Clayman was not being cooperative with letting our bills do. And he was dragging his feet. After like 17 hearings, letting it move out of committee at the last minute where there wasn't time for it to get through the process in the second year of a 2-year cycle, right? And so what we did is I put the entire legislation in an amendment and put it into a bill that had already passed the House, so it didn't have to go back through the committee process over there. And I think it was the last day of the session or maybe the second to last day, put the amendment on the floor into a bill that only would need a concurrence vote in the House, and probably made my most profound speech on the floor because it was really pathetic the way rapists were getting off the hook. And so very powerful speech. It passed unanimously and it went over to the House and passed. So that is a way when a bill gets blocked, but we'd have to look to see, is there another bill on fisheries? And then could you get 21 in the House and could you get 11 in the Senate? But that is a strategy also we could consider. I'm guessing Trident would be making phone calls, and it is election season. So who knows? And yeah, that's just the strategy if the bill is dead. Just the fact that they're funneling, that would be an interesting post, David, is to point out and take images from those reports of that money going to those committee chairs who have the control of the bills related to trawl.
Yeah, I had done that last night, but I didn't realize that they were the committee chairs at both levels there, so I'll definitely update that. I think another thing that had really frustrated people, and maybe you have the more history on it, is when this came up in the Natural Resources Committee in May, it was advertised that there was going to be a public comment opportunity where the public could call in, but that I think got canceled kind of right before the meeting, and it ended up just being mostly the trawl industry testifying, which really frustrated a lot of people.
That, in my mind, that was very, very inappropriate. Typically, a bill sponsor can bring in their invited testimony to help point out the benefits of the bill. And I'm not sure how last minute was scheduled and why that didn't occur. But the fact that the trawl industry was in the room and the chair allowed them to testify, in my mind, was inappropriate. There should have been invited testimony scheduled that included both Senator Cronk's pro SB 161 if the chair then wanted to allow trawl. But I will tell you, it is typical that the opposition doesn't even speak in that first hearing. The sponsors typically are allowed to lay out the case and have expert testimony to support it. And the fact that the trawl industry was testifying and they were not limited to 2 or 3 minutes, which is usually the limit, they were treated, maybe they were technically invited, but if they weren't, they were treated like invited testimony. And I thought that was actually very inappropriate and frankly appalling. But now that you're telling me who's donating to these candidates, I'm not sure how much progress you can make in those committees. And that is a shame. That is a shame. And I tell people, I have people donate to me that might want me to do something. If it benefits Alaska and it doesn't conflict with my values and it's a smart thing, I can support it and move it through. But if they donate to me and I don't agree with it, it doesn't matter that they donated to me. But I tell you, there's too many elected officials that become puppets of donors, and that's pretty disturbing. So, there's something, I don't know if it's like a mental thing that I have just embedded. But as I was preparing, in the fall and looking at this, and I was getting ready to resign from the Senate, and it's like, okay, I'm going to have to raise money, which is the least favorite part of running for office, by the way. Just, it's not fun asking people for support. But I went back and I looked at all the people who had donated me in my past legislative races. And I have like this mental block because I so do not want to ever be bribed and pushed or a puppet. There's like, I block out and don't remember. And so when people would come to my office, they're always welcome. I have heard that there are elected officials, if you haven't donated to them, you're not going to get an appointment and a meeting with them. And to me, that's really pathetic. In our constitutional republic, we represent all the people. We should hear from them. We should listen to their input. And then we have to weigh what they're proposing and decide, does this make sense? Is this going to be beneficial to Alaskans? That's the way I function. But I have a feeling that certain people would not allow something to move forward if they've received a donation from a certain industry. And that's kind of sad.
That
I don't even know how it's legal.
Just to clarify, so that when industry testified in May, Kathy Giesel would have been the chair of that as well. Correct. Okay.
Yes, she was. Yes. That was her call to do that, to allow them. Yep.
Okay. Good to know.
Politics is so much a part of this, right? Because it's policy that's allowing the destruction of the habitat and the decline of the fisheries in the state. And so you have to be engaged with the election process and the policymakers and who's going to be serving. And I would tell you, for some of these things, you have to not just look at who's the next governor, but who should be in the legislature. That's, I think exposing where people stand on the issue. I know that there's a lot of focus on many other issues in the state, whether having to do with other types of resource development, gas and oil and timber, or whether it has to health matter or education. There's a lot of discussion about the who in the legislature should be reelected, who should not be reelected. So, that's something the stop bycatch people might want to think about.
Shelley, do you mean on a state level or federal level or both?
I'm talking about a state level.
Yeah.
I think that conversation is already going on the federal level. But what I was saying earlier, I don't think you could have the most pro stop bycatch people in the whole wide world on our federal delegation, and they could not get something through Congress because of this required 60 votes. It's just not going to happen. So to me, you should be focusing on the governor and the state legislature.
Yeah, I think those are good points. Was there something?
And there is a tie, though. There's a tie for the legislature because the legislature confirms the Department of Fish and Game Commissioner, and that person has to lead this effort at the NPFMC. So there actually is a tie. So let's say we get a governor you and I don't want, that's not going to take a stand, is a puppet of the industry. If you had the right legislatures, you could not confirm the Fish and Game Commissioner until they put one forward that would take care of this. So there is a tie.
Was there something that's
really valuable?
Was there something, Shelley, which stuck out to you from that NPFMC advisory panel meeting in regards to testimony? I mean, I assume you heard dozens of people testify. Was there a recurring theme?
Yeah, I didn't stay long. The only testimony I heard was on our side of the issue. Now, I'm sure maybe there was some. I don't know if anybody tallied it and how many were on the other side, but the only testimony I heard was basically talking about how Alaskans are taking the hit, that we are the sacrificial lamb in the situation, whether it's the other commercial fishing industry, sport, personal use, subsistence, we're the ones taking the hit, and it's not right. So that's what I heard.
Yeah, I think there's hundreds of that compared to everyone for industry, but it doesn't seem to stick in the same way.
Yeah, I think a big takeaway for me is I think this stuff has just been slipping by over the years, and there hasn't been a real proactive, concentrated effort to address it. And I think Alaskans are ready for that. And it's going to be important to get the right people in the right places in order to make traction on this. And, there's sometimes you have a little bit of time to play with. I don't think we do as far as the overall fisheries, because what happened in the Atlantic, right? Decimating the whole fisheries industry. And I don't know if we've had biologists or anybody who've told us how much time we have left, but my sense is if we don't turn things now, we don't have a whole lot of time. And then if you decimate the fish populations and the habitat, could you ever restore it? It would be decades. I have no clue if you could. It could be 100 years or more. I don't know. I don't know the science on that. But I would say there's not time to play with in this case. I don't know. Would you agree with that, David?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the interesting thing about this conversation is that people don't want to protect fish just because we feel bad for the fish. People want it to be a sustainable resource that we have access to that people can profit from forever. And that's part of this grassroots movement.
Mm-hmm.
And it makes it bipartisan. We essentially have Republicans and Democrats coming together on this ecological or sustainability or conservation issue, but it's because it makes sense and because we want to be able to profit from it, show it to our kids and have it feed our kids if it ever comes down to push to shove, kind of being an island state up here.
I really get into the deep details of policies, and that's why I say solutions, not sound bites, which in itself is a sound bite. But everything that I am suggesting, I have like a plan and like feasible steps to get there. So paired with this, I've been having really deep meetings, long meetings with experts on the game side. And one of the things that I'm going to do as your next governor, we'll say that in faith, is at the high school level, we're going to be pushing vocational training because, someone could become a commercial fisherman, for instance, doesn't necessarily need to go to 4 years of college and rack up a bunch of college debt, right? So we want to have vocational training in our high schools and maybe even a little bit of a touch on it in middle school. One of the things I would also like to see as a vocational education course in every single high school across the state that would at least be optional for credit is something on hunting and fishing. Because first of all, those are good, wholesome activities. It's also part of our sustenance as far as food, but also the next generation, they're the ones that need to be the caretakers, right? They need to make sure that we are protecting our resources and allowing them to be managed properly to meet human needs and for our economy, right? So I would love to see some kind of vocational training for young people in that. And that also, what happens is you can get them engaged at advocacy young. It's fascinating how interested young people are in policy because sometimes as adults, we get in the thick of our lives and all the busy things we have to address and paying the bills and all of that. But young people, they're coming kind of looking at it from the outside, and they actually are able to perceive how impactful policy is. So I'm seeing a lot more young people on various issues step up. And I think if we were to engage our young people earlier, that they would be helpful with issues like this. They'd want to make sure that we are good stewards and responsible stewards in managing things for the benefit of Alaskans. And so I just thought I'd throw that in there because I think on the game end, we have declining caribou populations. I was learning recently that Sweden, who has a larger population, has triple the moose we have. Somehow they're managing their moose in a different way. And now we're concerned that we could lose moose deer, connected to the decline in the salmon. So these things are all connected. And I think it's important to bring our young people on board on these issues.
I couldn't agree more. In fact, just this last weekend, I cornered the Anchorage municipality. He's like the school district-wide debate manager because my daughter, who is 11 and a half, is in middle school debate. And I suggested the trawl issue be covered by the kids.
That'd be a
he
good
took
one.
a note in his notebook. I'm going to keep pushing.
Yeah.
Oh, your heart seems to truly be into this.
Yeah. I lived in Hoona in Southeast in the 70s when I first came, and I was living off the grid at the time in a cabin, no electricity, no running water, outhouse, cooking, heating, wood stoves, the whole 9 yards, but trying to live off the land as much as possible. And fish was huge, clamming. We tried growing our own, we were growing our own food as well and raising, farm animals, cattle and chickens and all of that. Harvesting the fish was really a big part of it. And I think in Alaska, I understood how important it was. Now, I will admit, my first baby, I got pregnant, my first child was born there. And the smell of salmon for a period while I was pregnant, was really hard. It took me a number of years to get over it. Then I got back, okay, I'm loving it again. But I think early on, when I was born in Ohio, so it came up when I was young, I realized the importance of our resources, and the fish resource it can keep you alive, literally. That the whole thing about food security, a lot of people think, oh no, it would never ever happen. Well, we might not be totally cut off, but we could be cut off substantially. They were coming close to striking at the Seattle port. That would really inhibit, the abundance that we'd have on our store shelves. And so I think Alaskans, we're fiercely independent. We like to, be self-sustainable as much as we can. And you have so many people who do a big portion of their diet is based on fish. And the farther out that people live, the more so. And it's a huge savings as far as grocery bills too. Not to mention the nutritional value is so much better. I'm sure if you're eating some fish, from the grocery store freezer section that's brought up from some other part of the world, it's not going to have nearly the nutritional value that something caught in our backyard is. So there's just so many benefits, and we have to make sure that it can go forward for our kids and the next generations. And like I said, I don't know how much time we have left if we don't address this, and I also understand there are a lot of factors, but this is the one that's related, a human cause that we have some control over. And so some of these other things, as far as China and Russia and things like that, or what may be happening as far as water temperatures, we can't address that through a policy change at the state level. But this is one we can. This is one we know is a problem, and this is one where we know what the remedy is. So we'd be fools not to move forward on it.
Well, the trawl industry bycatch issue is humongous. Not only are they taking valuable species like halibut, crab, and salmon that we all rely on, they're taking the forage fish, the pollock, that all of those species rely on. There's so much more to it than that. They're taking the bait fish that all these other species rely on as well, herring, etc. This is kind of a left field question for you, but it comes to mind. So have you put any thought into the state-run hatcheries and the exuberant numbers of salmon being fed into the ocean that are also contributing? That's a man-made. You brought up the man-made problem, and so
yeah,
it just kind of was
I
like,
need to
that's
learn
another
more
big
about that.
Yeah,
I've heard, some of that, and I think they're doing that. Aren't they doing that in Russia too? That could be impacting. I think
yes.
one of
But
the things I'd like to explore. I had a big meeting with a bunch of experts on the game side, but we slipped into fish a little bit, and
yeah,
I need to delve back into it. But just wondering about the possibility of more king salmon hatcheries. And I don't know if David, if you've thought about that, whether that would be something we should look at doing.
Yeah.
I'm learning, and that's another thing. It is foolish for an elected official to think they know everything and should make the decisions. You got to look to experts, and that's one of the things with agriculture. I'm not an expert. I do have farmers on my mom's side, and like when I was in Hoona, was trying to farm to live and all of that, but I'm not an ag producer. Years ago, there was a huge ag boondoggle because you had state bureaucrats making decisions that they should not have been making. They should have been looking to the experts. So, relying on what the experts know and what they advise is really, really important. So as far as king salmon hatcheries, David, what do you think?
Well, I think there's a big push for those from the sports side, but I think commercial has for a long time taken on the financial burden and the literal physical work burden of running the hatcheries we have now, and they're looking for bang for their buck, and I think pink salmon pencils out best for them. So to tell them that we want to see more king salmon and that's going to be essentially money out of their pockets probably doesn't work. But I think the residents would love it, and I think the residents would probably be up for supporting that through license fees, et cetera, if the state took it on. They also get into those there'll be this breakdown on hatcheries between the ones that are in the saltwater and the ones that are in the river, because the hatcheries kind of concentrate the genetics. So normally you would have 10,000 fish spawn, there'd be this huge mixing of genetics, but When you do it in a hatchery, you take maybe a dozen of them and you just select those genetics. And then when the offspring comes back, it's like brothers and sisters mating essentially. And so you keep concentrating it into just a little bit of genetics. And there's a big debate about whether or not you start to lose that diversity and lose survival ability. But on the other hand, we're losing king salmon altogether. So maybe it's a conversation worth having, and maybe technology helps us out now in a way that it didn't 20 years ago.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's funny, is like rely on the science and the research, and that kind of all went to pot during COVID. You had people with different views, but I do think a balanced report. In fact, at the state level for both game and fish, you've got your state biologist and things like that. And one of the things that I would want to do is to make sure you're having independent research coming in as well. I'm sure you have some state biologists that are very good in their field and work to be non-biased, but we're humans and we can have our biases, and some biologists are trained to be more preservationist, kind of nature's way, not disturb things, and that's according to our constitution. We're supposed to be managing for the maximum benefit of the people, and so the people are front and center in that equation. And so having independent research and science to maybe kind of balance out what we're hearing from our own biologists, I think that is something that I would really like to see, and then sort out what is best.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And to build on something you'd said earlier about innovating and not giving up when something gets tough as one of your attributes, I was really impressed with the first time I talked to you. I think there was a team of maybe 12 people on the Zoom call. And I've been speaking with candidates on both sides of the aisle, different races, for 6 years now. And that absolutely stood out as one of the biggest, most innovative response. A lot of times I talk to them and they say, oh, yeah, and well, what about this? What about this? And kind of naysaying it. But it was a lot different in that first conversation with you guys, that it was people were out talking me and beating me to the punchline of like, hey, maybe we could do this instead. Maybe we could do this instead. And like that idea of troopers as observers came up. And I just very rarely see that people are that innovative and thinking ahead. So I think that's proof that you take it on in a meaningful way, which is all we can hope for.
Yeah.
She did say she was solution oriented.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's why I say it's all about solutions. Because ultimately you have to build the foundation of understanding the issue. But then as soon as in that discussion, the problems start to appear, I immediately start going to, okay, how do we solve that? How do we solve this? What could you do? Okay, what about this? No, that won't work. So what about this? So that's my goal, and all the different challenges Alaska is facing, bringing together people that have been working in these areas, understand the issue, start to learn the problem, and then start to putting together feasible solutions, because you're going to have pie in the sky solutions that aren't going to happen. And sometimes you can shoot for those things that maybe are more difficult, and you need to because it's the right thing to do and there could be a breakthrough, but you also have to have the things that are feasible as well, at least to make some progress. So I think that the things we've talked about to stopping bycatch, I think they could be done. And you just have to get the right person in office and make sure they're the kind of person who is persistent, that sticks to their word. I think that hands down, I mentioned there's another, former legislator or two that have done some work in the legislature, but I think the things that I've gotten through, they're major things, and also that consistency of word and the persistence factor. I think I kind of have that one hands down.
At one point, so a big trawl conversation or talking point, I guess, is how much money they pay in taxes, or obviously the economic input into coastal towns. But hadn't you done up a number on essentially how much it would cost, like a resident on the Yukon, to import fish, or essentially how much they would end up spending on protein if they didn't have that salmon self-delivering?
I'm trying to remember.
I think it was thousands for a family.
We had a range. Yeah. It was in the thousands also. Yeah. And we also talked about the landing fee. Was that for halibut, where it's like 43 cents a pound or something, where if it could be sold to be $8 a pound, and how that would be so much more beneficial for our economy. Yeah, those numbers are fascinating. A lot of people's eyes glaze over, but those are the kind of things that get my attention as this is an issue that needs to be addressed,
For
right?
sure.
Yeah, and with the cost of fisheries, when you're talking about a family being able to have fish as a protein source, it's a real thing, even more so than it was. You take away the thousands of dollars they're not getting in PFD, and you're talking about thousands of dollars of increase in grocery prices. It makes sense for us to address this fisheries issue. It's huge to families.
Sure. I think one of the talking points specific to the pollock trawl industry is they say they paid $21 million in state landing tax fees in 2022 or something. But anyways, if you take that 21 million they paid to take close to 3 billion pounds of fish out of Alaska waters, or the waters off of Alaska, split it up between all the Alaskans, it comes out to like $27 per Alaskan, which somebody pointed out isn't even enough to buy a pound of king salmon a lot of the times. There's just that cost benefit analysis that it's great to have candidates taking on and taking an analytical look at.
Yeah, I agree. And it's great too, David, all the data that you have assembled and gotten out there. It's very, very noticeable. And some people don't, those numbers don't mean, I think it's different brain types or something. But for a lot of us, I think those numbers speak louder than words as far as the problem and why we can't delay and we have to address this. For other people, their eyes do glaze over and they just, are the more general statements that fisheries are declining. We have to do something that works for them. But I think there are a lot of people that, as far as decision makers, that those numbers do matter. And the data that you get out is very important.
Yeah, for sure. Well, and I mean, it's mostly just cut and paste from the NOAA reports, but it's all been so codified that it's really tough for the layman to understand it, I guess, or even people that know a ton about it. Yeah, so something we've started asking people or that we want to make a theme in these is, and I think you already answered it, is if you would accept money from trawl, or I believe you put a post out on returning it. What was your policy on that?
Yeah, I made a commitment that I wouldn't, and if unknowingly I did, that I would return it. So reports are out. I think if you look at my report, you'll see I haven't taken any, but if I did, if something slipped in there and I didn't know it, let me know and I will return it. But I would say I committed I'm not going to take it, but I'm also not a puppet to any donor. And that may hurt me because some people do like to donate in order to control the elected official, but I don't operate that way. And my door is open, to good ideas that benefit Alaskans. That's just how I function. That's my MO.
Thanks for that, Shelley. Seeing too much of the opposite choice these days.
Yeah. Yeah. So at some point, I would love to get some names of potential and I always have to get those initials, NPFMC appointees. And I don't know who is going to be assembling a list, but I'm not going to pull names out of a hat. I want to know exactly where people stand. And I want to look to people that have been working on this issue for a long time to get a pool of names from which to choose.
One of the most interesting things about that is, to me, off the top of my head, the best pool of names are the people that have essentially been kicked off of the advisory panel and the NPFMC, because it does. So there's a tricky thing with the NPFMC is that
it's a really good point.
Like myself as a charter fisherman, I've been drug into these other issues and quotas, but it is so the NPFMC doesn't just talk about charter halibut; they talk about salmon, crab, habitat, on and on. And so you do have to have people with at least some biological background, and not everybody fits that mold, even if they don't like trawl. But what we've seen in the last 10 or 15 years is since the NPFMC is allowed to pick its own advisory panel, if they don't like somebody on the advisory panel, or if that person's trying to put forward motions which restrict trawl, they get kicked off, essentially. They don't get back on there. But those have been great people and potentially great advocates who know the issues. They've been involved in this process, but they are just getting booted off by this partisan source. So we could definitely put those together, and that would be a great starting place.
Yeah. That would be wonderful. And David, I mentioned something about, I thought it was very inappropriate and strange that the council appoints the advisory panel. Do you know if that's in law or in regulation?
I'm not, and they have done some weird things with that. Like the number of people on there have varied. I think they're supposed to have term limits for the advisory panel, which has kind of been a little bit fuzzy. A couple years ago, they did this deal where they eliminated a couple seats on the advisory panel, and Coincidentally, one of them was one of the most vocal advocates against trawl, and so instead of not renewing her seat, they just eliminated it. I don't know what the governor's responsibility is in that, but that should all definitely be fleshed out. And it shouldn't be gray area in the first place. That's crazy for us. I mean, everything in the federal regulations is down to the last bullet point. It's the Wild West in the advisory panel.
Well, the good news is if you got 6 out of 11 that were on the same page, then that would impact the makeup of the panel.
Yep, that's the immediate.
The problem is you're fighting that every term, right? And if it's, in my mind, it should be an independent body, so it would be good to get that fixed if we can. It would be at the federal level, of course. I'm just curious because getting regulation changed is a lot easier than getting a law passed. So I'd be curious how that appointment process, where that exists, or it could just be an internal policy that the council change. I don't know.
Yeah, and there's another interesting thing on the federal side is, so the NPFMC has a recusal policy where essentially saying that if a voting NPFMC member is owner of X amount of quota in the fishery they're voting on, then they have to recuse themselves because conflict of interest. But they don't have to recuse themselves if they're the employee of a corporation that has X amount of quota. And so what we've seen is this switch away from actual on-the-deck fishermen who might own the resource to now we have a bunch of employees of trawl corporations who aren't forced to recuse themselves because they themselves don't own this quota. So that, again, would be something that the federal delegation in D.C. could work on, and that wouldn't have to, I mean, that could benefit all the regional councils across the United States. That's just good governance, essentially.
So, and again, knowing whether that has to be fixed in law or fixed in reg, and the federal delegation, they certainly can weigh in on it, and that would be important. But a governor and actually Alaskans could press for that too. The regulatory process is a public process for all the different federal agencies and departments, and so we don't have to just rely on the federal delegation for that. But we have to know, is it a reg change or a law
For sure.
change?
And I know you're busy in a campaign year, but those might be a couple great example letters for people to do too, like looking at this makeup of the advisory panel or what the recusal laws are. Maybe there'd be a chance to lead on that, and then people could read your words and sort of dogpile in.
Yeah, if we don't, but we have to know what we're addressing. Are we contacting the U.S. Secretary and say, hey, you need to fix this reg? Or are we pressing Congress to fix a law? So I don't know if you can find that out, David.
We'll find it out.
Yeah, so both on the being an employee, that was one, and then there was an earlier issue too where we were talking about whether it was reg or statute. Do you remember what that was?
The makeup of the advisory panel, there was some conversation.
Whether the appointment process is in regs or statute. Yeah, if we could find out on both of those issues, we could start to work on them if they're in regs. I mean, we could bring it up to our delegation if it's in law, but we've talked about that earlier. That's going to be much more difficult.
So I think we're getting a little short on time, but one last question that we are trying to make a theme of these, and I think you kind of answered it already, is essentially to say if these common sense restrictions like taking midwater trawl off bottom means that trawl is effectively banned, are you okay with leading that or opening up that conversation?
Yeah, because it's essentially, it's their choice if they want to move out of the waters altogether. So they're choosing to be banned. If we're just giving tight restrictions, follow the rules so we don't have this bycatch problem, so we don't destroy our habitat, you can stay. So yes, I think it's ultimately their choice. That's what they do, then that takes care of the problem as well,
Well, thank you. That was definitely plenty for everybody to absorb this first go round. Shelley, we do wish the best for you.
I can press, like I said, it bothers me when people just kind of put out rhetoric and don't take steps to do things. And that's why whenever I've learned for an opportunity to push NOAA or push the IPHC or the FMC or the legislature, I'm there front and center, and I'm going to do that.
All right. That means a lot, Shelley.
Yeah. Thanks a lot. And
well, I admire that with all the things you have going on, you're willing to throw in your hat to help us with this too. So that really speaks volumes.
Yeah, when you think about it, when you step back, it all boils down to a 4-letter word, life, Life, because whether it's nourishment for people or their economic livelihood, it's all about the lives of Alaskans. And that's why this is so important. I also think that's why it resonates with a broad sector in so many Alaskans, similar to our very early conversation about that bad soft on crime bill. That was because it impacted people's lives, the essence of life, and they don't want dangerous communities. And on the fish side, we need our nourishment. We need to have a strong economy, and we need good livelihood. So yeah, it all boils down to life. This is a life issue.